My name is Brian Wurtzel. I'm originally from Jacksonville, North Carolina, moved up here in 2010. I basically was a military brat, if you can call it that. My father was in the Navy as enlisted. He was a in-flight troubleshooter on a helicopter in a squadron. And back then in the 60s, they actually allowed you, if you were really interested, to fly the helicopters with the pilots. So that's where he got his love of helicopters from. And then he decided that once he was done with this, he was going to go to college. Went to college and then decided that he wanted to become an officer. And I think there was some sort of issues with going back in the Navy, so he decided to join the Marines, and they took him.
So you know about what year that was?
That's a good question. It would have been probably around, I was born in Milton, Florida, outside of Pensacola, where he went through flight school. So it's probably around 74 when he joined the Marine Corps as an officer. And I think he only did one term. I think it was 6 years. So I think that would have pushed him out probably about 1980, 81, I think. And he loved flying. He thought it was the greatest thing. To this day, he even still gripes that there's too much traffic on the road and he'd rather be flying a helicopter to avoid all of it.
Do you know what kind of helicopters he flew?
Yeah, he was in a twin-rotor CH-46, which are probably phased out right now. They were the ones with the two...
Chinooks?
Chinooks, yep.
And you still have them?
Yeah, I know that some places do, but the Marines are kind of getting away from
different.
it. Yeah, they're doing the Ospreys now.
There's something wrong with them people.
Yes, yes, there are. My dad never liked the Ospreys. But what he did when he got out, he did some odd jobs here and there, and then he got offered a job at the simulator building in New River Air Station in Jacksonville, North Carolina. So as a family, we stayed. So he trained pilots from all over the world. I know there were pilots from Canada, pilots from Israel, pilots from Spain probably. I mean, he trained them all, and he would do advanced tactics and emergency cases and whatnot. He was given the nickname by some Japanese pilots, Blood and Guts. And they gave him one of those little bandanas around his head, and they put red in it to make it look really good. And the reason they did that was because he was ferocious. He would sit in the back of the simulator at the computer and type in so many different scenarios. And he did this because he wanted them to be prepared for any situation. And that was probably the first time that I had a dealing with the military, as I would go visit him on the base, whether he would bring me and my brother or my mom would bring us. And I got, back then, this is when they allowed you to do it, I got to sit in the simulator and actually fly. Now, I was never as good as my father. I mean, I could hold my own with the collective and with the stick and raise and lower the helicopter and fly forward. I mean, I was pretty good at it until he decided to sit in the back and start an emergency thing. And the one I'll never forget was he programmed an emergency, and I think one of the rotors went out in the back, or the engine went out, and we started twisting. And he said, okay, you got about 60 seconds to land this thing. And I'm like, what do I do? Because I've never done this before. And he's like, well, I'll talk you through it. Before he even got out the first or second sentence, there went the simulator. And this was on hydraulics, so it moved around a lot. And it was the coolest experience. I mean, you're talking 80s. This was before graphics on computers were really that good, so everything was blocky. I mean, they put New River Air Station really blocky with a blocky water tower and everything. But it was one of the coolest experiences I had. And I knew that if I were going to do anything military, I would follow the aviation path because it was just that great.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So after that, graduated from high school in '93. Prior to that, I had been thinking about going to college, and in my junior year, I was talking to my dad about it, and I said, well, there's places I want to go. Ohio State was a big one because my dad graduated from there, and we had relatives in Ohio. And I said, I really think I want to do that. I want to go to college, but I don't know what I want to do yet. And my father thought about it for a second, and my grades were, I was pretty good. I was a pretty smart student, but my father thought about it for a minute, and he goes, you know what? You really should join the military because you have no self-discipline. You'll flunk out in your first semester of college. And I thought, wow, that's pretty abrupt. So let me think about it. So I spent a few months thinking about it, and I was looking at different brochures, and And I was trying to find the easiest of the services. And my dad always joked that because Marines have some squabbles with the Air Force and their aviation, my dad was always like, well, the Air Force is easy because, they've got most money, they always have the better equipment and the better room and board. And I said, and food, yeah. And I kind of looked at it and I thought, you know what, the Air Force doesn't really travel that much. I mean, yes, they get stationed overseas and whatnot, but I wanted to go places. And I heard his enlistment and what he did in the Navy. And I said, I think if I join something, I'll join the Navy. And my dad was actually, accepting of it. He said, well, that's a good branch to serve. They've got good aviation programs. I think you should talk to a recruiter and get started on that. So I don't remember if it was must have been my senior year when I actually went in and talked to the recruiter. I took the ASVAB. We took SATs down in North Carolina instead of ACTs up here.
ASVAB?
ASVAB is the military entrance exam. Don't ask me to tell you what the letters mean. I forgot most of the acronyms in there, but it's a military entrance exam. It's a standardized test. It basically tells them what are your highlights and what are you good at, whether it's in English, math, science, things like that. They can tell from the standardized testing. So I took the exam and I was given a list of rates for the Navy. And I looked at them and there was only one aviation rate. It was air traffic controller. Everything that kind of looked really interesting in the aviation field, I wasn't even offered. And one of the ones I set my mind to was aviation electronics technician, or they call them ATs. ATs repair the radar and weapon systems of aircraft and helicopters, depending on the helicopter. And I said, you know what? I said, that's what I want to do. And the recruiter said, well, unfortunately, that school is backed up. It's backed up about 6 months. There's people waiting to get in. Oh, okay. But the recruiter, you know how recruiters go, well, we have a list of things over here you could take. All right, let's go through them. So my father is with me, thank goodness, because I would have probably been pushed into one. So we started with air traffic controller because that was an aviation rate. And I looked at my dad, and he looks back at me and he goes, it's the most stressful job in the Navy. You probably wouldn't like it. So I said, all right, we'll pass. Next up was hospital corpsman. That one actually was probably the main one I would have gone into because I was really into health and medical. I always said I wanted to be a doctor as one of the things I wanted to do when I grow up. And the recruiter, knowing that that I was interested in this and knew that there was an opportunity for me to come back home, had said, another nice thing about the corpsman is that the Marine Corps doesn't have corpsmen. They don't have medical personnel. They take it from the Navy because the Marines are a department of the Navy. So he goes, the corpsman you could possibly be attached to a Marine Corps platoon or, group in North Carolina. And I said, oh. And then my dad looked at me and he knew about my past history that I didn't play sports and whatnot. And he goes, you'll be getting up at 5 a.m. doing physical training or PT. Oh, okay, well, maybe I don't want to do that. My dad goes, well, it's a good rate, you can be on ships and doing this stuff. And I said, but there's no guarantee I'll be on a carrier or anything, that's got flight ops. And he said, no, there's no guarantee they'll do that. Okay, well, let's go on to something else. I remember being offered electrician's mate. Now, my father in the Navy was an aviation electrician's mate, so he worked on the electrical stuff on the aircraft. The electrician's mate works on the stuff below decks. I kind of talked to the recruiter about maybe they can switch this to aviation, but the recruiter had looked it up and said, well, that one's kind of full and they're not offering that. Pretty much what you have in front of you is what you get. Oh, okay. So what else? The other one, and this is the last one that I can recall, was Seabees. Now, Seabees, I believe, were created in World War II, and they were the construction arm of the Navy. They were the ones that, along with the Marines, landed first on the island, and they got busy building infrastructure. So when they were doing island hopping and whatnot, you know, they had a version of the Seabees that started building up aircraft, airports or fields and buildings and things like that to house, you know, the people that were coming on. And I looked at my dad and I said, okay, so this is construction. He goes, yeah. I said, I have no idea how to build anything. You know, when I use a hammer, I don't always get the head of it. You know, I'm very bad at this stuff. And the recruiter steps in and goes, well, your math scores were really good. He goes, you got the aptitude. We'll teach you everything else. So in Seabees, they had 5 different sub-rates. So you could be a constructionman, heavy equipment operator. There was a plumbing type of rate. There was electrical, I think, or something along those lines. And I forgot what the last one was. It might have been something to do with engine or powering, you know, the structures and whatnot. And I actually really was looking into that. And to top it off, my dad actually said, you know, they also get trained in weaponry. So you're going to be firing guns and whatnot, be certified. What? He goes, yeah, what do you think they do? Sit on their butts when they're building stuff? If the airfield gets attacked, they have to fight back. There's only so many Marines that could be there, but you guys have to defend it. Oh, that's really cool. This is looking really good right now. And the recruiter goes, yep, and it's a 6-year commitment. You're kidding me. Nope, you got to be in for 6 years. Oh. So at that point, I was pretty much at a loss. I thought this was what I had to do. Now, thankfully, my father was there, so my father had said, don't you have an unrated program, you know, where they can get in and test the field, whatever? And if I remember correctly, isn't it like 2 or 3 years? You can tell the recruiter was like he was going to lose his bonus or something because he couldn't push me into it. So he goes, yes, there are 3 areas they can go into. Seamen, which is shipboard activities, firemen, which do the engineering and damage control, and then airmen that will work with planes and on the flight deck and whatnot. I mean, I smiled, like biggest smile, and I said, I want to do that. Yeah, I said, that's what I want to do. And my dad said to me, and you can actually strike or go for one of the rates that you want to do. You know, you can get one of the manuals and start learning the rate and then take the test when your 2-year enlistment is up to move into one of those rates. And I was excited. I'm like, that's what I want to do. I'm going to be an AT. I'm going to go in at 2-year and re-enlist for 4. And like I said, you could tell the recruiter was not very happy with that decision. So I signed the dotted line, and in August of 1993, after I graduated college 2 months before, or excuse me, high school 2 months before, I had said, all right, goodbye mom, goodbye dad, I'm heading off into the Navy. So they sent me down to Orlando, which at the time was open. There was 3 boot camps. There was Orlando, San Diego, and Great Lakes, or what my dad called Great Mistakes, because that's where he went when he was in boot. Orlando was probably not the best choice. I didn't have a choice, but they sent me there. Now, Orlando in August is extremely hot. One of the nice things I thought about Orlando was that it was also the only co-ed boot camp. So, of course, every sailor going down there was thinking they were going to have a girlfriend, you know, across from them at the end of the service, or into boot camp. So I went down there for my training, which was 8 weeks of boot camp. It was, I honestly don't remember a lot of it. I do remember being a postal, I guess you can call like a postal clerk within boot camp, within your company. And I was the guy, along with another guy, in charge to go get the mail. And we were well liked because obviously we were getting the mail.
So you were inland, Orlando's inland.
Yes.
You were anywhere near the water, were you?
No, no. And it's funny you mention that because I'll get to something that had some water to do with it. But when I was the postal guy, you know, I was extremely excited about this. And to tell you really quick, one of the funniest things that happened while I was in there is halfway through boot camp, you do what's called work week. They stop doing your training and they send you off to work around the base for a week. My company commander was an aviation machinist mate, kind of about this high, big buff black guy, and very vocal, obviously. When you look at somebody like that, you think he's going to tear your head off. And I remember my dad always told me, make yourself disappear in boot camp. You do not want to be noticed. As soon as you get targeted by your company commander, you will never be forgotten. I made sure I disappeared. I, didn't do anything wrong. I stayed out of the eye of the company commander, except this one time. Wurtzel, get your bleep in here right now. Everybody stops and looks at me, and I'm like, what did I do? Go into his office, shut the door. I shut the door, and I'm standing at attention. Yes, Company Commander Spates. I'm not going to have some low-life nuke, puke, below decks. I can't even think about it. I'm not going to have this guy work in my mailroom during work week. I'm going to send an airman over to work week to work in the post office. He's going to go to the galley, and he's going to wash dishes the whole week. Yes, Company Commander. Went back to my bunk, realized that as there were two of us, for work week, I got the good job. I got the cushion job. I was going to go in the post office and route mail and things like that, and he was going to go wash dishes for a week. Now, he didn't know this at the time. So the whole work week, I'm sitting there just sorting mail, and it's really easy. I mean, there's air conditioning. I'm loving this job until the end of the week when we got to go back. And I go back, and my compatriot, who was a nuke guy going in for nuke school, goes, oh man, the galley was really tough, washing dishes. How did the post office go? I said, oh man, I was sweating so much, the mail was backed up this high, heavy boxes. I think it would have been better washing dishes. I just went into it. So as it went on, we started doing advanced tactics and learning about everything that you can about the Navy, minus, all the stuff you were going to end up going into. Because there was a school for me, basic airman school, that I would go after I graduated boot camp. So I go in and we learn about, now you mentioned that Orlando's landlocked, there's no water around there, except when we did our swimming test, there was a pool. But one of the things is they made a replica of, I believe it was like a destroyer. It wasn't the greatest looking thing, but it was the USS Blue Jacket. And one of the things that you had to learn how to do was fight fires, because when you're on a ship, there's nowhere to go. Obviously, you can jump off in there like the Titanic, but probably going to be shark bait really quick. So we learned how to do firefighting with water, and the decks would just slowly rise up. We learned how to shut watertight doors and, how to keep certain parts of the ship, so it was still buoyant and it wasn't leaning on one side or whatever. And basically, they had vents of fire just raging, and we're up here with the hoses just fighting fires like, real firemen were doing. And other than the pool, that's the closest that we got to water.
Did you go to a firing range or learn how to do anything with weapons?
Yeah, we learned on the .22 pistol. They always figure that if you're in the Navy, you're probably not going to do a lot of shooting around. Those are meant for the Master at Arms, who are going to be your cops, ordnance men, like gunner's mate class or rate, I should say. They were going to train on that, but they were going to do it at a school afterwards. So we had to get basic qualified on a .22 pistol. So we didn't get the cool stuff that everybody else did. I was hoping I'd get to fire an M16 or an M4 or something, that was better than a pistol. But it was still cool. We learned how to, handle it and whatnot. And I remember the range instructor said, it's generally the same for every other pistol, except you're going to get a lot more kick, the more that you go. So graduation came approximately October, I believe. And I had orders to stay because I was going to be going to basic airman school, which was, I believe, about a 1-month-long course in Orlando that was attached to the base. And this is where they taught you all the aviation aspects.
Going back a little bit,
yeah.
Your graduation, was that a pretty big ceremony then? Or?
Oh yes, yeah. The pass-through ceremony, there was, we had other companies besides us. We were a co-ed company, so we had women in opposite of us that we kind of drilled with or marched with together, and they lived in a connected building to ours. So It was really big. I couldn't even tell you how big it was, but I remember the parade field was huge, and there was all of us there. And I remember our company commander said, whatever you do, don't lock your knees because you're going to pass out in this heat. 5 people in other companies didn't listen to that message because they had to pull them off, during the review. But yes, it was big, and we had people from all over the world show up, and I don't know if they were invited or they were relatives of people, but some were officers. And when you're in the Navy, you learn about all the different ranks and officer insignia and whatnot. But we had no idea what these people overseas were. So we always were told, if you're not sure, salute.
Yeah, right.
So we would salute as somebody walked by us. But yeah, and unfortunately my dad didn't come down, my mom wasn't there. My best friend from high school did. He drove 12 hours down, I believe, from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Orlando. And I had Liberty for the weekend, so we were out and about, doing some cool things. And I'm glad I had somebody there because it was a relief to see somebody from home.
Good.
So back to the Airman School, we basically learned everything about, the basics of aviation. If you're unrated, the talk is that you're going to be chalking and chaining aircraft. Chalking meaning you put these chalks along the wheels to keep them from moving, and then chaining down aircraft. That was kind of your enlistment until you picked a rate to do something else. And those are the blue shirts that you see on the flight deck. Each one has different colors that do different things. And after I got done with basic aviation school, they had told me that I can get an extra week of Liberty if I worked at the recruiter's office. And I thought, well, this is something I shouldn't pass up. So I went back and spent a week working at the recruiter's office, and then I had a week off.
Went back to
North Carolina, Jacksonville.
Okay, back to your hometown?
Back to my hometown, yep. So I was
That's pretty cool.
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I was a pretty homesick guy back then, so I knew I would love that extra week. So I did. That's what I did. And I was just so excited with it. And then the time came where I got my orders prior to leaving that I was to be stationed at the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN 69, one of the nuclear-powered ones. And that was in Norfolk. You had a choice in boot camp to choose either East Coast or West Coast, and they would do their best to put you there, but you couldn't choose what you were going to be stationed on, whether it be a squadron or a ship or land-based. So, like I said, unrated airmen, they always need the chalkers and chainers. They need people to tie down the aircraft. That was pretty much what I was going to end up doing. I got lucky, however. When I got to the Ike, they had a Christmas party, and I met a personnelman, the guy that sits down in the office and does all the records and sends people to various places. And I mean, I was just having a good time with him, and I was telling him, I said, I really don't want to be a chalker chainer. I really, really want to work in as an AT. I said, is there anything you can do? And he's like, oh, heck yeah, I can send people around all over the place. I'm like, sweet. So with orders in hand, I went to AIMD, which is Aircraft Intermediate Maintenance Department, I believe. AIM.
And where's this at?
This is at the front of the ship, and this is the people that take all of the gear. They're made up of different rates of aviation, and they work in a shop setting where they repair things. Now you have the ones that are with squadrons that are on the deck. They're basically taking things off, and they come down to our shop, but if they can't always figure it out, our guys help with that. So AIMD is basically the place I really wanted to be. Other than being in a squadron, I was going to learn how to do the stuff hands-on. Now imagine, to their surprise, my supervisor that I was reporting to opens up the door, looks me up and down, sees I have no rate on, and goes, "You got to be kidding me. Where did you come from?" I said, "Well, these are my orders. I'm going to work here." He bows his head down, and he's just thinking, why do we got this guy? How do we get this guy? So he asked me that question, and I told him what had happened. So I go in there, and basically I get told right away, well, you're the lowest ranking person in here, so you're going to be doing all the cleaning. I said, that's fine. I have no problem doing that. I said, but I want to be an AT, and I want to learn from you guys. So, they were up for it. They were, okay with it, and they were going to teach me what they could. Unfortunately, with any 2-year person, you have what's called temporary active duty, or TAD. So you get sent around the ship to do odd jobs. So I didn't last there very long. I was probably there a couple of months, maybe 3 months at the most. And then I got sent over to the galley, and I was washing dishes and doing that stuff at night. And then I got sent to the berthing area, which is where everybody is housed. And I was cleaning up there. I learned how to do plumbing, locksmithing. I was working on AC units. I mean, basically everything that had to do with the bunk areas, you know, and the showers and the bathrooms and whatnot, I was doing. And then after that, I went to what's called PMS, or Preventive Maintenance Shop. And that was what I did the remainder of my enlistment. Those guys go out and do advanced stuff. So they seal watertight doors. They go to fan rooms and clean or repair things in there. I mean, you have a laundry list of stuff that you have to do, and every week it's like a rotation. It's like new stuff to do, and then the following year it's the same thing.
So did you go out on maneuvers or anything? Or?
Yep. And I should actually get to that first, because this happened way before. So we were kind of dry docked in Norfolk. We had just left dry dock, I should say. The Eisenhower, the Ike, was being refitted because we were going to have...
Is that nuclear?
Yes, nuclear. Yep, okay. CVN 69, the N stands for nuclear. We were being outfitted for the first warship to carry women on board. Now that was a big thing, because the Navy wanted to prove that this could work. So they had their own quarters, they had their own bathrooms and whatnot around various places on the ship. I started seeing a lot of the aviation rate women, including officers, show up. In fact, one of the times I was in PMS, I had a spot check, meaning that an officer comes in and wants to see that you actually did your job. And she went with me to a fan room to see that, you know, I checked off everything and I did everything correctly. And I always did my best when I was in there. I wasn't going to slack off, because I wanted to make a good impression, because if I was going to re-enlist, I wanted people to remember that, to help me down that road. So this would have been about start of December 1993 was when we started sea trials. Now, sea trials are when, after your ship is in dock and outfitted, they now need to go out in the water and test it and make sure everything's working properly. So at that time, I believe I was working, actually I don't even remember, I was doing something out in the hallway because I was asked to help, and we were painting something in the hallway, and they announced over the intercom that they were getting ready to do some high-speed turns. And they have a closed-circuit television, you know, in a particular area. There was an office that had one that was peeking and looking. They did a turn so tight that you could see the edge of the flight deck was nearly touching waves. You know, they were testing to make sure that everything was operational before we went out on cruise. We were scheduled to go on a cruise in August of '94, the following year. So we had to work our way up from sea trials and make sure we were operationally ready. And of course, you know, they needed to train, you know, the women that were on board and making sure they were all set to go as well. So we can fast forward to, I believe I was working, I was still working in the galley, the 3 months rotation that I was in there. And we received orders because there was an attempted coup down in Haiti in '94. This was approximately July or August, I believe. I know it's in the documentation I sent. So we were told that we needed to get down there and stop this coup from happening. Well, we're a Navy ship. We're not going to do it by ourselves. Sure, we can bomb them with the aircraft, but no, they were going to do something new. This was something that, from what I heard, was the first time ever done in history. It was called adaptive force packaging. And what it was is we were going to work with another service outside of the Marines to transport down to Haiti. So the Army came up, and they chose the 10th Mountain Division up in New York, and we were going to go up to New York, and we were going to load in soldiers and all their helos, helicopters, and Humvees and equipment that they needed, and we were going to taxi them, as the Marines like to call us, a taxi service, taxi them down to Haiti and drop them off.
On a carrier?
On a carrier, yep.
Okay.
And I have a couple of pictures I know that I sent, and I have more too. of showing Cobra gunships and the equivalent to a CH-53 troop transport in the Marine Corps. Blackhawks is what they're called in the Army. We had Blackhawks on the deck. They were strapped down in the hangar bay. I mean, it was something that my dad had never seen, obviously, and I was just jaw-dropping at the amount of equipment that, other service that we're putting on board here. And at the time, I was still working in the berthing, and we ended up having a squad of soldiers in our area. And, no offense to the Army guys, but they don't take showers, or I don't think they take showers often, because they were stinking really bad. And I remember I was trying to decide which person to talk to, because I didn't want to get, beat up. But I went over to a guy and I said, we do have showers here that you guys can use. And he laughed and he goes, we do, but we're getting, prepped mentally and whatnot, because we're not going to have that stuff when we disembark. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So fast forward, we went down to Haiti and we dropped everything off, and it went extremely easy. It was, the quickest disembarkment I've ever seen of gear.
When you say dropped everything off, you couldn't go, did you go into a base?
Nope. We, they took off, their helicopters took off from the deck. They loaded the soldiers up into Blackhawks and they took them out. Then the Blackhawks, would carry on the bottom, the Humvees and whatnot, and take them out to the land. That's how they landed on Haiti. I don't believe we had any base down there at that time. I could be wrong, but my recollection is they just all went off one particular day and they saved the day. It turned out that they prevented that from happening or overturned what had happened there. So we had to get back to Norfolk because we had, I believe, a few weeks before we were going on our Mediterranean cruise for 6 months. So we had to turn around and get everything ready to go. Well, in that time,
you didn't bring them back, though, did you?
Nope. They had some other way of getting back because they knew that we were going to be gone, by the time. And they were an occupational force, so they were going to be there for a little bit too.
Okay.
So somebody else was either going to help them or they were going to, fly maybe to Miami or something like that and disembark there. But we had to get back quick and get ready for our cruise. So our cruise, like I said, I believe it was August, the end of August that we were going. I had leave for a few days, so I went home. My birthday's at the end of July, so I celebrated with my family. Last time I would see him for 6 months, and my dad made a nice little cake with an aircraft carrier on there and 69 on the front because that was the number of it. And I just remember, being a great time because I was pretty homesick and I wanted to spend quality time that I could. So back on the ship, we had a visit from Bill Clinton. Our president came out. And prior to when I came home, I remember this. So he was in the hangar bay and he was talking and congratulating a job well done. And then he came out and shook everybody's hands. Now, I'm not going to pass up the opportunity to shake a president's hand. So I went out in the crowd, made sure I shook his hand. And my dad found out about this. My father is a staunch Republican. And when I came close to his door, as I was coming home, he goes, "Don't you dare touch my doorknob with that hand." And I had a black woman lived across the street, and she loved Clinton. And she and my father would sit on their porches and argue back and forth all the time. And I remember her saying, "Oh, you can come over here, I'll shake your hand." and I said to my dad, I said, Republican, Democrat, I said, it's a president. I can say that I actually shook a hand of a president. So it was pretty big for me, despite the fact my family didn't like the Clintons at the time. So back to leaving. So the first day that we left, I remember that I was standing duty. Now, duty is a required day that you have to go around the ship and do odd jobs. Like if they're putting supplies of food, you had to go help out because it's your duty day. My duty that day was standing watch, and I was over by the gangplank, the area that people walk up to the ship to request permission to come aboard. I was there with a chief, an officer, a chief petty officer, an officer, and a first class officer. Now the first class officer was the one looking at people's IDs and allowing them on. The chief sometimes helped out if it was backed up. My job was to be a gopher. So if they wanted coffee or the officer wanted coffee or they needed me to go grab something, they sent me off to do things. I didn't look at people's things and let them on.
How long does his duty last?
It lasts a day, usually.
Day, 8 hours, 12 hours?
12 hours, or 24 hours, I should say, because they can wake you up in the middle of the night, and
Okay.
and then the next morning at like 8 a.m. is when the turnover happens. But I was there when we were lifting up the gangplank and leaving, so I got to see us bringing everything up, and then they were out there taking the ropes off the dock, and we started getting pushed out by towboats, because carriers don't go out by themselves, they get pushed out by towboats to a certain area.
Sure.
So I was one of the last people to see see Norfolk before we left, other than the people that were on the flight deck.
So when you were there, you had the Eisenhower. How many other carriers were docked there, you remember?
Oh, that's a good question. So you don't always have carriers docked there, because you got to have a certain number of carriers out in the ocean, and some are docked there. Some are in dry dock as well. I believe the Roosevelt might have been there, because Theodore Roosevelt was going to be taking over for us after our cruise ended. So we would meet them halfway and exchange pleasantries, and they would go to the Med, and then we would go back home, is how they did that. So I believe the Roosevelt was there because they weren't in dry dock. They were getting ready to do their sea trials, because they had to make sure they were ready to go to relieve us. George Washington might have been there too. Being a Navy dock, there's tons of ships. You have assist ships too. You have destroyers, you have cruisers. You're going to have, there wasn't an ambulance ship there, but those exist. You're going to have supply ships there as well. Submarines, I don't recall if we had any there. We might have had one or two, but I know they have a base up around Rhode Island or something like that. And this part of task force goes with the Ike. Now you can't always see them because they're miles off, but the Ike usually sits in the back, because they're the most, or the aircraft carrier is the most protected thing in the fleet, plus the most expensive. They don't want that thing being destroyed. So they'll have destroyers, cruisers, and subs out in the front. Supply ship is usually hanging back with us, or they're farther back, so they don't get attacked. And all the while, we have aircraft, E-2C Hawkeyes. They're the big planes with a dish on the top, which serves as radar. And they would sit up in the air, and they would just constantly, monitor everything for miles and miles out there to see if there's any threats. And then when we had flight ops, planes taking off the deck, you'd have a helicopter from the squadron, because it was required to be out there if something happened to a plane. Pilots ejected out, they had to be over there trying to rescue them. So that was typically flight ops in a nutshell. I remember the first part didn't really go so bad. When we had done our build-up and our trials, we went to Puerto Rico for a couple of days, maybe 3 or 4 days. I remember that. So that was a test of going down, stopping, giving us a chance to relax, because we were out at sea for maybe a week and a half or so, so they wanted us to have some leave, a short time, and then pack everybody back up and then go. We also stopped in Fort Lauderdale, I remember, parked there, and got to get off and have some fun, and then get back on and leave again. And that was during sea trials. They were just testing everything from not necessarily docking, but hanging off port, stopping, starting, things like that, making sure all that worked before we went back and started our cruise. So we left from there, and I can't even tell you possibly the order of every place that we stopped at. I do know the countries that we went to.
Did you, when you went into port, did you get off the ship?
Oh yeah.
Go
yeah,
tour?
And you had people that had duty, so I would be on duty during port for maybe a day, but other days I was free to go, provided I didn't have any work going on. And the people that were on duty usually took care of the work. So I got to go off, and I tried everything I could. I tried touring, walking around. I took lots of pictures. Unfortunately, they're not digital cameras back in the early 90s, which I really would have enjoyed. It was all 35 millimeter, and I had all these rolls of film saved up, and go back and hit up Kmart or Walmart and develop all of them. And all the pictures that I have, unfortunately, I'm not like my mother where I turn it on the back and write down where it was from. I can't even tell you where all the places were. But I do know some of them because, for example, we stopped in Cannes, France, near Marseille, or maybe Marseille was the one we stopped at. But that was Christmas Eve, 2 days before Christmas Eve, that we stopped there. And I had planned on taking an overnight trip to Paris because I really wanted to see Paris. So they drove us up 2 days prior to Christmas Eve. We got there Christmas Eve, checked into the hotel we were supposed to be at. I'm an odd duck. Back in the day, I didn't want to try anything new, so I went over to French Burger King and ate there, I think, for dinner. I was really leery about trying things like escargot. I wasn't going to eat a snail or anything else. I really wanted to stick with the stuff that I knew. One of the things I got to see was Jim Morrison's grave from the Doors, because he's buried there in Paris. Went over to the Cathedral Notre Dame, took pictures of that. Went and saw, at the time, Interview with a Vampire was in the theater, and I really was itching to see a movie, so I got to watch that with French. They were speaking French, but they had English dubbing at the bottom, so I had to read the whole thing as the movie was going on, because I had missed out on that. I didn't get to see it, back in the States. And I took the subway system around town. It was one of the best trips, ever. And Christmas Day, I called everybody in my family, almost, even friends, I think, had an AT&T card, racked up about $500 worth of long distance charges.
Really?
I got reamed at by my dad afterwards. He said, that wasn't a good idea. I said, I know. I said, but I'm homesick. You know me, I'm that type of person. And I just had to call everybody and wish them Merry Christmas. So that came out of a good, chunk of my paycheck right there. So we loaded up from there and continued around the Mediterranean. Now, we weren't joyriding. There was two other things that we were dealing with also. We were involved with the Gulf War, the tail end of it. They were still doing no-fly operations where they weren't allowing Iraqis to fly around there. So we would sit off the coast of Iraq and then send out planes and just make sure they weren't doing anything, suspicious. So that led to me being a Gulf War veteran, even though I wasn't really there during the main force. But the president said the Gulf War was still going on at that time in '94. We also went to Bosnia and set up camp outside of that area and made sure they weren't doing anything suspicious. So all in all, I was a part of 3 different campaigns: Haiti, Iraq, and Bosnia, during a 2-year enlistment, which is unbelievably cool, because
Right.
My mom was freaking out, and I told her, don't worry, I'm in the most protected thing in the fleet, and she thought we were going to get bombed. And I said, no, we're fine. I'm on an aircraft carrier. They're not going to let that thing get hit. There's plenty of other things around here to prevent that from happening. So all in all, we went to Turkey, we went to Greece, we went to Italy twice, Spain, an island off of Spain, Palma de Mallorca, France, Israel, which out of all the places, I thought Israel was the best. Not only was it the best, but my dad had trained somebody, a pilot there. And my dad gave me his contact information. I got a hold of him, and he invited me to his house for dinner one night when I was on shore leave. And I got to meet his family, got to learn about how the Israeli military worked, how their kids are required to do so many years of service. And then they drove me around Haifa and showed me all the locations. Like, there was a university built on the side of a mountain, which was really cool. And then at the end of the night, they dropped me back off on the pier, and that was it. So we got back approximately April, I think, after doing the 6-month cruise. I remember we went around a hurricane. We didn't go through it, and the winds were really, really rough. And I always heard stories about smaller ships getting rocked back and forth. It doesn't happen with a carrier. It's kind of like a gentle back and a gentle forward. And I worked in a shop that didn't have, we had linoleum floors or floors like that, and we had casters on our chairs. So we would sit there and we would roll forward and we'd roll back and we'd roll forward, and it was just nothing to us because we had been used to it for a while. And this was about the time the OJ trial was going on. So the only TV that we had was satellite to CNN, and I believe there was European MTV because all they did was electronic music and maybe a couple other channels. So we didn't have much in our downtime. But we watched the OJ trial, so we got to see close to the start of it to the verdict, or maybe right before the verdict, I remember. So that was cool. And we went around a hurricane when that happened, and then we met up with I believe it was the Roosevelt, and wished them luck, and they said, congrats, go have a rest. And then they went into the med, and then we just went back into Norfolk. And by that time, I was about a year and 9 months into my service. Now, at that time, Clinton was doing what's called an early out program. He was looking for people that wanted to leave the service early. I had been approached by one of the guys in our group who was the recruitment guy, and he came up and said, we need to talk about your reenlistment. And I said, well, I want to be an AT. I said, that's what I want to do. Well, it says here, look on the computer, it says here it's still backed up, 6 months. Well, I want to get out. This is really what I wanted to do. There was no other job I wanted. I sat in a shop for a few months. I learned how everything worked, fell in love with, the playing around with the equipment and testing it and fixing it and things like that. And that's what I wanted to do. So around the same time, Clinton had that early out program where he said, if you want to get out early, we can let you out early. So my 2-year enlistment ended about 3 months prior. And then I was able to get out and start prepping for college, and then I got accepted to a college in Durham, North Carolina. And in the fall, that's where I went. And then I was put on inactive reserve for about 6 years, I think. So if they needed to call me back, they would. I always got worried because that was close to the time that the Iraq War started, and I was married, and my wife was nervous that they'd call me up, and I said, they probably won't. I mean, unless they need some sort of gopher on a ship, I'm just an unrated E3, I don't have a specialty. And that was pretty much it. And then my time ended 6 years after I stepped off the ship.
So you say you were in reserves. You weren't called in.
No.
You didn't have to do any
No.
time.
No.
You were just.
They
could call you at any time.
Yes, this is called inactive, so I didn't have to be the weekend warrior or go out and train anywhere. My sheet said that you could be called back into active reserves or be back on active duty, but talking to my dad and talking to others, they said the chance of that happening in any conflict or whatnot is extremely rare, especially if you're unrated, because you don't have a job.
Yep. So you get out of the Navy, what do you do?
So while I was in the Navy, I applied for colleges, excuse me, because I knew I was going to go to college, and now I can tell my father that I have self-discipline, even though I didn't really use it during college. So I applied to several colleges, and I applied for North Carolina Central University was one of the ones I was looking at. That was in Durham, between Chapel Hill and Duke. So it was in a good place for education. I applied for Ohio State University, where my dad graduated from. I got accepted. I called my grandmother. I said, hey, can I live with you for 4 years so I don't have to pay out-of-state tuition?
Who did?
No, my grandmother. My dad's mother lived in Columbus, and she said no. And I was kind of distraught because I really wanted to go there. I applied for East Carolina University, but after looking at it some more, it's usually called the party capital of North Carolina of colleges. I said, no, I don't want to be tempted into doing that. It's a good school, but I wasn't going to attempt to do that. And then I think the other one was University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I compared Greensboro with North Carolina Central. North Carolina Central actually was going to give me a full scholarship. Now the funny thing about this, and my dad always laughs, it's predominantly African American. It's called a Historic Black College University, HBCU. They were going to give me a minority scholarship because they were trying to open it up to bring more people in and not just be called an HBCU. They wanted, a face of other people, to come. And that was hard to pass up. Also got a scholarship for being an honors student in high school, so got that for 2 years.
Well, you must have got some kind of GI money too for going to school, didn't you?
Yep, the GI Bill, but that wouldn't start until I started taking classes. So back then it was about $300 and something a month for 9 months when you were in school,
Okay.
and you got it over 4 years. So that did help out. You know, I was paying off a credit card, I think, from the military, and you know, I had a truck, you know, so I had insurance, gas for that, although gas was a lot cheaper back then than it is now. And then I started dabbling into computers, you know, which currently is my job in IT. I'm a systems administrator at DigiKey. So I started getting into the computer side and learning how to do that. So I was spending GI Bill money on computers and parts, you know, so I was kind of ignoring all the stuff that I needed to save up for the final 2 years. So I ended up taking loans out to pay for school, which currently I'm paying off again. So anybody, kids or adults watching this right now, save up money, don't take loans, because you want to be debt free as quick as possible, because interest kills. And yeah.
So you work at DigiKey now?
I do work at
And
DigiKey.
you're part of the IT
Part of
program?
IT, systems administrator, so I manage at least 1,000 servers that do various things around the company. So email server, application servers, virtual servers, which is basically image files on one particular piece of hardware that, you know, each image file can be one server, so you can have like 50
So how many
servers.
people work in IT there?
At the time that I recall, it was about 200, but I believe it's gone up because we now have, we've expanded operations, and I know that you know, we have a bigger building that's attached to the end of it, and we have a lot of contractors, you know, that are coming in and specified for certain things. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 300 or more by now.
Just working in IT?
Just working in IT, yep.
Of course, they ship all over the world.
Oh yes, yep. And they're even talking about possibly putting a warehouse overseas. I heard something about that. So if they do that, you know, now it's even quicker to get stuff from there.
So anything you want to add about your military service, Brian?
I loved it. If anybody is thinking about entering the military, I would highly suggest the Navy if you want to go places, because, you know, I got to see a lot of stuff that otherwise I might never see. I mean, I have England on my bucket list because I've always wanted to see the hometown of the Beatles. Found out that we're Irish a few years ago because we thought we were German because our last name is German. So my dad's 85% Irish, so now I want to go to Ireland just so I could walk in a pub and say I'm part Irish, you know, and raise my, you know, pint with everybody else.
And do it on St. Paddy's Day.
Exactly, that's exactly it. And I want to go to Scotland because I've seen pictures of the countryside and it's just gorgeous. I'll travel one day, but those that want to get an early start and travel, the Navy is good for that.
You married?
I am married, yep. I'm married to Sarah, and we have 4 children, one of which is finishing up started her RN, registered nurse. And then my older son, Jacob, is in commercial aviation at UND, and he's very close to getting his pilot's license after 1 semester of college, which is shocking because I didn't think you can get, you know, that quickly. But he goes out and flies all the time at the airport in Grand Forks. Loves it.
So the flying skipped the generation.
Yes, it did. And I was never really that great with going in a Cessna because I have motion sickness, so I've got to take medication before I go up. But my dad is extremely excited for my son, you know, and they talk every now and then about that. My younger son, Brody, is a sophomore at WAO, and my youngest, we call her the little devil daughter, because she watched growing up everything the kids were doing, so she knows how to, you know, crank that screw and turn it and dig it into you a little bit. Sophia's getting out, or graduating, I should say, from 5th grade because they have graduation ceremonies now. So
Good.
she'll be graduating and going to 6th grade at the high school.
Very good.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add, Brian?
Not really. It's a pleasure, you know, sharing my story. You know, if anybody, you know, has questions, they know how to get a hold of me, I'm sure. I am the scoutmaster of the local Boy Scout troop here in town.
Very good.
So I've done that for 9 years, and it's been a massive blessing to do that.
Very good.
So, yeah.
Well, Brian, I want to thank you for doing this interview, and thank you for your service.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.